In this video, I'll tell you all about ReactJS components. So components are basically independent reusable bits of code, JSX code, and they serve the same purpose as JavaScript functions, but they work in isolation and return HTML. So in React, there are basically two types of components: functional, stateless functional component and stateful class component. Now let's discuss about each of these components. So a functional component uses props as data and then they return HTML as JSX. So basically functional component is a stateless component, which means that it does not maintain state like a class component. This is the basic structure of a functional component. So over here I've created a folder called components. Inside that I've created a functional component. So in a functional component we'll use import React at the top. Then we use a functional keyword to declare the function followed by the name of the function. So very important thing to note is that inside functional component we always use a return keyword, and inside the return keyword we render the JSX elements. So over here the HTML in the form of heading is being rendered. Now when the component is done finished, then we export the component as default at the bottom. So after that, I'll just call this component at the in my class in my app.js file, and then call it import it and then call it in the app.js file in the return keyword. We can see that this h1 tag is being rendered. So this is the basic simplest example of a functional component. Now let's move on to class components. So class component always need to extend the React components keyword statement. They also require a render method, which is very necessary. Otherwise, the class component will not work. It is a stateful component, so it maintains state, unlike functional component, which does not maintain state. Now, this is the basic structure of a class component. Let's dive into the code. So in the components folder, I've created another a file called class component. So just like function component, I've imported React at the top. Then I use the class keyword to declare the component followed by the name of the component. And as I earlier explained, it needs to extend React component. So inside the functional component, one major difference is that we use the render method. So render method, inside the render method, we use the return keyword, and inside the return keyword, the JSX content is being rendered. So now when the component is finished, I call this component in my class component, app.js component. We can see that the class component is being rendered. Now let's just discuss about the differences between class and functional component. So functional components are pure JavaScript functions and they accept props as argument and return JSX. But on the other hand, a class component needs to extend React and it basically renders function. It is basically a render function which returns React element. Now the second difference is that functional component does not need a render method, but a class component always needs a render method. Third difference is that class components are stateless components. So they basically accept data, display data, but they do not maintain any state. But in case of class components, they are stateful component and they implement the logic of state, maintaining state and updating state. Now in case of functional components, the fourth difference is that it does not use React lifecycle methods. So it does not use methods like component did mount, component unmount, the constructors, etc. But in React class component, all the lifecycle methods can be implemented. So since lifecycle methods are not cannot be used in functional component, the latest version of React came with an update with a feature called hooks. So hooks can easily be used in case of functional component to make them stateful, to make them behave like stateful components. So for example, I've declared a constant keyword a name, and then the second value is set name, which is used to set the value of name. And then we are using useState hook. Inside the useState hook, we are using single quotes, which basically means that we are setting the initial value of name as an empty string. Now, wherever we want to set state, change the value of name, then we'll simply call this function name set name, and inside that function, I'll pass the name value of the name variable. Now, whatever value I set, it will be assigned to name variable. So this is how state is maintained by mimicking the property of a class component. So in class component, hooks are not used because it is already stateful component. So in class components, we write the constructor, create the constructor at the top. They use props as arguments, and they use the super keyword at the top, and then we declare the state using this state keyword, and inside that we create all the variables like name, email, date of birth, any kind of data, and we assign them empty values as initial values. The last difference I would like to discuss is that in functional components, the constructors are not used because state is not maintained. So no initial values are assigned. Constructors are used to assign initial values to the variables. But since there is no state maintained, so we do not need a constructor. However, in a class component, constructors are used because it needs to store the state.